All right. Well, pollinators play a really important role in the success. Can't hear me? See. Right. So this is better, isn't it? Thanks. I didn't realize Kitty had turned it off. Okay. So maybe that's why we said you had to shout. All right, so pollinators play a really important role in the success of your garden. And today what we're going to do is take a look at the importance of native bees and learn how to create habitat gardens for them. So this habitat gardening is becoming really popular. So in habitat gardening, you would learn the characteristics and life cycle of a particular insect or animal that you're interested in, and then you would create a garden for them. Pollinator gardens are especially popular as people are becoming aware of the decline with our pollinators. They are welcoming them into their gardens. But first, what you need to do is understand their lives and characteristics, what they need in terms of food resources and habitat, and then you can build gardens for them. Oh. See. Just 1 second here. Oh, it's this thing. Okay. Okay. I'm just going to use this here. Okay. So today what we're going to do is look at the importance of pollinators. We're going to look at 2 different pollinators, characteristics of both mason bees and bumblebees, and then what is driving this decline with our native bees, and then how to go about and build native gardens, habitat gardens for them. Now, bees are the most abundant pollinators of flowering plants worldwide. Nearly 80% of all flowering plants reproduce due to pollination from bees. Pollinators are considered to be important keystone species. Does anybody know what a keystone species is?
The other species around it are reliant upon its production for their success. Perfect.
So the answer from our audience is that it's a species that other ecosystems in the ecosystem are dependent upon. So if it's removed from that ecosystem would be greatly altered. So think about this, the fruits and seeds from insect pollination make up more than 25% of the diet of birds and mammals, ranging in size from those little redback voles all the way to those really big grizzly bears. Now, there are a lot of insect pollinators, bees, butterflies, moths, some beetles, wasps, and flies. They all pollinate flowers. But out of these, bees are by far the most important. And there's a reason for that, in that bees actively collect pollen and transport it to feed their young. So none of these other insects are feeding their young with pollen. Now, just as Mary Anderson went through pollination last week, she did such a nice job. Pollination occurs at blossom time. Pollen from the male part of the flower, the stamen, as you remember, is transferred to the female part of the flower, the pistil. And if that transfer is successful, it can result in the formation of a seed. And that seed gives the plant the ability to reproduce. So pollination brings about plant reproduction. There are 3,600 species of native bees in North America. Bees descended from wasps about 130 million years ago. And there's something else that happened about 130 million years ago. Does anybody know? It might be kind of hard. Go ahead. There may have been a mass extinction, but there's something in particular that happened too. So 130 million years ago, yes, it was the evolution, started the evolution of the very first flowering plants. So the angiosperms came on about 130 million years ago. So we have two things going on. We have the evolution of bees and the evolution of flowering plants. Now, let me ask you a question. Why do you think the flowers bloom throughout the growing season? Why don't they all just bloom at one time of the year? Let's say that it's a really big thing in the third week of June, everything goes into bloom, and that's it. Why do you think there is that things bloom through the growing season? Very good. So the answer from Kitty is the pollinators. So plants evolve these different flowering times throughout the growing season, and it's to provide pollinators with a constant supply of food. And that also decreases competition among the pollinators. Now, what do the flowers get out of this? The flowers are providing pollen and nectar. In return, they get pollination services. So they have reproductive success. They can grow a seed. Now, our bees are also doing this sort of thing. Not all of the bees emerge at the same time. They're emerging at different times of the year as they're also partitioning these floral resources. So notice here is a mason bee. And you'll see the dates that the adult is around from April through July. So kind of beginning of April through the end of June or 1st of July. So notice those dates. So that tells you that the mason bee is a spring bee. And it's not the bee that's going to be in your garden pollinating your zucchini and tomato plants. It's gone by then. So instead, what you're going to find in your garden in the summer months is going to be the bumblebees. And there's 3 species of bumblebees that are really common in our area, Mason County and Thurston County. And I just want to go through those 3 species. There's more than 3 species, but these are the really common ones. So there's one that is out right now, and I noticed people were reporting it in January. That's the black-tailed bumblebee, Bombus melanophagus, and it is active from January to June. And they have particular plants that they tend to favor. And one of the plants that the black-tailed bumblebee favors is rhododendrons. And they say basically that in June, you'll see that the black-tailed bumblebee will start to disappear. And that corresponds with the time that the rhodies, or rhododendrons, and they're blooming. Now, there's also the yellow-faced bumblebee, Bombus vosnesenskii. Notice it's got a really long growing season or life cycle in terms of being an adult, February through November. And I'm willing to bet if you learn a bumblebee, if you can learn one species, it's going to be this species. And the reason is that they're very common. They have big colony sizes. They can have as many as 1,000 members in their colony. And they are an urban bee, so you're more likely to see it. Also, they're really distinctive. They have that just one patch of yellow on their abdomen. Very common bee, so remember the yellow-faced bumblebee. And then the third bumblebee, the last bumblebee that I'm just going to talk about is the yellowhead bumblebee, Bombus flavifrons. And once again, note those dates, April to October. So what's really happening when you see those dates is you'll see on this histogram that even though we said April through October, notice that you don't really start seeing any bee activity until May. And there's a reason for that. The first bees that emerge in some point in April are the queens. And this is amazing to me. They're emerging out of the soil. So that beautiful queen is coming up out of the soil, and what she needs to do is start a colony. So she will go underground, generally into a little rodent hole. She'll lay her eggs, but it takes 5 weeks for those eggs to develop into worker bees. So that's why it may say April, but you're not really going to see any activity for at least 5 weeks. It's a batch of small bees or her first bees that come out, and then she'll continue laying eggs through her life cycle. But then notice it's really July by the time that colony size really expands. So that gives you an idea of what you're seeing when you're seeing these dates. Now, I know that you've all heard, we talked a bit about this already, this coevolution between bees and flowering plants. Well, over time, bees started to select plants that were more attractive to them. So in turn, flowers developed colors, they developed fragrances, and even nectaries to draw in the bees. Bees, in turn, developed hairs. Remember how we said they evolved from wasps? Wasps don't have hairs, but bees do, because those hairs are for pollen attachment. They also, some bees have developed pollen baskets for transporting pollen. So in this instance here, let me go back here, you can see this bee coming in, a bumblebee, to land on a lupin. Now, bees figure out, it's like a key, they figure out how to access the pollen and nectar out of a flower. So in this instance, the bee is going to land on that bottom petal, it's going to open up the flower, and then start to gather pollen. So it's like a little key that they figured out how to do. Once they figure that out, they'll often stay with that species while it's in bloom. So what are the bees getting? They're getting food. What is the flower getting? Reproductive success. Now, we're going to talk about mason bees. Mason bees are really the perfect spring bee to have. They're a great bee. And what we're going to do is look at the importance of mason bees and some of their characteristics. So mason bees are a solitary bee. They're very gentle. They're ideal for cities, backyards. They rarely sting. The reason they rarely sting is they do not have a nest that they need to patrol and protect. They're a solitary bee, so that makes them more gentle. Notice the color, this is the blue orchard mason bee. The exoskeleton has that beautiful bluish color to it. Now, overall, it's going to be the females that provision the nest with pollen and nectar. And they have these large mandibles. It's not for biting. Instead, those large mandibles are for carrying mud. So they will be transporting mud into the nest as they build their nest. They also have these specialized hairs on the bottom of their abdomen. Those hairs are called scopa, and they are for pollen attachment. They do not have pollen baskets. So remember, they're an early season, April into the end of June. They're an early season bee. They tend to favor fruit trees. So let's just imagine now a mason bee buzzing around in its orchard, and it comes and it lands on a blossom. And as it plops down on it, some of that pollen that is on the anthers at the top of the blossom now get deposited on those hairs. Now the bee takes off and it flies a little bit and lands on another blossom. Well, some of the pollen from the previous flower now gets deposited on this new flower. And that's what makes the mason bee so good at pollination and cross-pollination It's estimated that they can visit as many as 1,100 flowers in a day. Now, mason bees are going to live in above ground cavities. They do not excavate their own nests. Instead, they're going to seek out existing nesting holes. So in nature, they might use reeds or stems or holes in trees that were created by other insects, like beetles always are chewing into old logs to create nesting area. But a lot of backyard gardeners like to have nesting blocks. So they like to have blocks like this here, where they can then have mason bees in their yard to help with pollination. And overall, I think a lot of folks just really enjoy watching the mason bees. So the tube diameter is about 5/16 of an inch, and that's just the perfect size to allow the mason bee to go in and out and carry mud, but not so big that they have to make many extra trips with that mud. 6 inches long allows them to go ahead and lay both male and female eggs. Now, with your boxes, you want to hang them off so that they are facing the southeast. Does anybody know why you would want them to face the southeast? Warm up. That's right. You want to put them in a place that they're going to capture early morning sun. Remember, all insects are cold-blooded. So that early morning sun will warm up the box, it'll warm up the bees, and allow them to get out and forage. Now, some people have had problems with birds getting into the nesting boxes, or possibly little mammals. So some folks will put up a wire mesh in front of their box over the front. And the best thing to use would be like this chicken poultry wire. I just want to caution you, do not use hardware cloth wire. The holes in that are so small that the bees, as they would fly in and out, would tear their wings and they will die. Once a bee tears its wings, it doesn't survive. So let's look at the life cycle now of a mason bee. So it's an annual life cycle, so it's a 1-year cycle. And we'll start in the spring because that's when they emerge. So the male bees are generally going to emerge when the temperatures are around 57 degrees, so somewhere the end of March or 1st of April. The females will emerge about a week later. So the males are buzzing around in front as they're waiting for the females to emerge. And sometimes the males will actually actively extract a female from the nest in order to mate. Now, after mating, the male bees will die. The female stores the semen and uses it to fertilize an egg to create a female offspring. Unfertilized eggs will become male. So after mating, the first thing that this female bee needs to do is feed. I mean, sometimes we go a number of hours and we say, oh my gosh, I'm starving. Well, these bees now have gone about 8 or 9 months that they haven't fed. So they are in this state where their bodies are very depleted. So they need to go out and feed to rebuild their bodies, as well as these females need to rebuild their ovaries. After feeding for several days, they kind of disappear. You may not see them for several days as they're out eating. Then they will seek out a nesting hole. So once she finds a nesting hole, the female is going to go out and gather pollen and nectar, and then she's going to bring it back into the back of the tube. She'll mix it with some of her saliva, and she makes this beautiful pollen and nectar meal. And then she's going to go out and she'll back into the tube and lay an egg on that pollen and nectar meal. Then she seals it off with a layer of mud. So this egg is the first of about 25 to 30 eggs that she will lay. She generally is going to lay 1 to 2 eggs in a day. The nectar is going to provide carbohydrates or energy for her, as well as vitamins for her larvae. The pollen is protein, so it's going to help develop the bodies of these little larvae. So this is a cross section of a tube. So you can see the mud partitions that are in between here's a pollen nectar meal, here's the egg, and then mud partitions in between. And that creates a little chamber. So the female eggs, that she lays the eggs, will be at the end of the tube. The males are at the front of the tube. Remember, it's the males that emerge first. At the very end of the tube, she's going to cap it off with an extra thick layer of mud to help deter predators. So this is what happens then. So she's laid her eggs. Out of that egg crawls a little larvae. That larvae's in this little chamber between mud, and it looks around not very far to see anything. And it finds this beautiful pollen and nectar meal that its mother has left. So it starts to feed. And this shows you what happens over about a 3-week period. So you can see, here's a little larvae. You can see the larvae is now getting bigger and bigger, and that pollen and nectar meal is getting smaller and smaller, until after several weeks, that little larvae consumed all of the food. And at that point, that little larvae will spin a cocoon and will go through what's called pupation. So this is the time that the little larvae now will change into an adult bee. So this is going to be generally, we're looking right now at the end of June, 1st of July, that this is happening. So at this point, you may want to put your bees into storage. So you want to make sure, very carefully put them into storage. You want to make sure that they are out of the way of predators. And maybe you'll have built a nice screened-in little area in your garage or a shed for them. Or you could do something like this too, where you just take a Tupperware container, drill a bunch of holes on top, put some screen over the top here, and then put your tubes or your nesting block into this. So that's another way that you can store your bees. And then you could store them in your garage or in an outside shed. But be sure and label them as mason bees so nobody just thinks, oh, I don't know what's in there. Let's just get rid of it. So what's happening now to the bees during the summer months? Well, they're going through more development. So that's why you do not refrigerate them at this point. They've got to be in an environmental temperature to continue their development. So you can see from larvae inside the cocoon, this is all happening inside the cocoon. The first stage, as they've spun this cocoon, they're a larvae. And then in their pupation, they develop into adult bee. And the first stage is this stage right here. And if you look, you'll see the 3 body segments. You can see the legs. You can see the eyes that have developed in that proboscis. But the bee still has this white pupal skin. And then by the 1st of October, you now have an adult bee. So notice the pupal skin is now very dark. The bee is totally formed. It has wings and all. It's ready to go, but it doesn't go anywhere. Does anybody know why the bees don't emerge the 1st of October? It's too cold. Remember how insects are cold-blooded, so they can't fly if it's cold. And when you look around outside, there's no food for them. There's no flowers for the most part. So instead, they go into this nice state of rest. And they rest until they emerge the following year. So this is the time of year that you would want to, the 1st of October-ish, right around there, this is the time of year that you would want to go ahead and clean your cocoons. And there's a number of reasons that you want to do this. And we'll talk about that in just a little bit. There is a YouTube video, so you can go to YouTube and put in Mason County Master Gardeners, Mason Bee Cocoon Cleaning. Sherry Clemens and I made this a number of years ago, and you can look at how you go about cleaning. Now, once you've cleaned your cocoons, you just set them out to dry for a couple hours, and then you'll want to get them into like refrigeration. Because remember, they're going to go through about 8 months or so that they're not going to be feeding. And they have found that if you have the temperatures pretty constant, like at 37 degrees, that fat, those body fats will deplete at a slower rate than if you just have them in your garage or something like that. So most people have refrigerators that are frost-free, and that can be a problem for the bees because that dehydrates them. So you'll want to put them in your crisper drawer. Next to the bees, you'll want to put a little bowl with a sponge in it and some water to keep the humidity up. And remember, don't put apples, pears, those types of fruit in because they can off-gas ethylene, and that very well may kill your bees. All right, so now we are moving into the end of March, 1st of April. Temperatures warming up, and we're going to find that the little bees are going to start to chew their way out of these cocoons. And you can see these are males right here. They have that little shock of white hair on their heads. They're also much smaller than the females. So they'll emerge from their cocoons, chew their way out, and then they'll start this whole cycle of life again. Now, just because you are a very cute little mason bee doesn't mean that your life is without peril. There's a lot of things that can happen in the day of a life of a mason bee. So let's take a look at some of these perils and see if we can figure out some things that we could do to keep them safe. So there's pollen mites. Pollen mites attach to the female bee's hairs as she is going in and out of the nesting block. And once they get into that nesting block, they'll detect that pollen nectar meal and they'll drop off onto it. And then, so the female bee just brings them in by accident. And then they reproduce. So these pollen mites will start to feed on that pollen and nectar meal and reproduce. And they reproduce so much that they actually eat the pollen and nectar meal. Poor little larvae bee now has no food and it will starve and die. Also, if you don't clean your cocoons, what you find the following spring, so let's say that this is being left through the year, if you don't clean them, let's say then this bee here, as it emerges, it has to go through that area with all those pollen mites. And what happens, they just get coated in pollen mites. So then they take it out to flowers, they bring it back into the nesting block. You just perpetuate a problem. So that's why one of the reasons it's so important to clean your cocoons the 1st of October. Also, there's the Houdini fly. Now, this is a non-native. It's actually the size of a fruit fly. It's in that family. And what happens is the mason bee mother leaves. She's going out to forage for a little bit. The Houdini fly is watchful, and it will sneak into the nesting tube and lay her fly eggs on that pollen and nectar meal, and then she flies out right away. Well, those fly eggs then turn into little maggots, and they start to feed on that pollen and nectar meal, and they will outcompete the little mason bee larvae. That little mason bee larvae will starve and die. So once again, if you clean your cocoons in October, goodbye Houdini fly. And then one last peril that we'll talk about, and that is parasitic wasps. So overall, parasitic wasps are like superheroes. They're really wonderful in your garden. They will kill a lot of pests. But there's a species of parasitic wasps, Monodonta maris, that will parasitize mason bee cocoons. So that is a problem. So you can see, this is the parasitic wasp, that's Monodonta maris, and you can see the ovipositor here, where they are injecting their eggs into the cocoon. Those eggs will become larvae. The larvae are always hungry, and they will feed on that mason bee that's inside the cocoon. And then you may notice later, see these holes here? So those are the emergence holes, because that parasitic wasp goes through its entire life cycle inside the cocoon and then emerges as an adult. And that's where they emerged right there. So what can you do to keep the little mason bees safe? You can put your bees into storage the end of June or 1st of July and protect them from Monodonta maris. Monodonta maris emerges right at that time. So 1st of July, end of June, you're going to start seeing these little tiny parasitic wasps around your nesting blocks. So getting them put into storage will protect them. So let's just take a look at bees. Bees have two sets of mouth parts. They have mandibles for chewing, as well as a proboscis for sucking up nectar and other fluids. And both honeybees and bumblebees can produce wax. So they can excrete this wax through thin sheaths from their abdominal segments. They'll chew that wax, make it soft. The honeybees will add it to their honeycomb, but bumblebees will make cute little honey pots out of it. Once again, it's the female bees that are going to build the nest and provision them with pollen and nectar. Now, here in the United States, there's thought to be between 46 and 50 species of native bumblebees. In Washington State, we have 26 species. So that's a lot of bumblebees in Washington State. And I was really impressed by that fact. In fact, I started looking up other states to see how many bumblebees they might have. And I thought, well, think about the South. They have that long growing season. Think about Florida. They must have almost all the bumblebees. But when I looked it up, they only had 7 species. And there's a reason for that. And it's because the bumblebee is a temperate bee. It likes the cool weather. So look at all of the hairs. It makes them really furry. They're big. And they have this ability, they can dislocate their flight wings and pump their flight muscles and warm their body temperatures up a couple degrees. So that gets them out foraging early. In fact, one of the bumblebee species lives on the Arctic Circle. That's how far north they can go. Out of all the native bees, they're considered to be the most social. They have a queen, many workers, so they create these colonies. So let's look briefly at the life cycle of a bumblebee. So we're going to start in the spring once again. Well, we could start anytime. You can see it could have been January for our black-tailed bumblebee, but you start at the beginning of their life cycle. And the bees, the female queens that are already fertilized from mating the previous year, are now going to emerge. And they are emerging out of the soil. So they overwinter in the soil, just a couple inches underneath the surface of the soil. So they're already fertilized, so they don't mate. Instead, they need to feed because once again, they have been in the soil for maybe 7, 8 months or more, and they are very depleted. So they need to come out and feed. And then they'll seek out a nest so that they can start to lay their eggs. Now, bumblebees carry pollen. So the pollen gets all over their hairs. I'm sure you've seen bumblebees in your garden with pollen all over their hairs. And they'll groom the pollen into pollen baskets. They'll put it in pollen baskets, which are specialized hairs on their hind legs. The nectar is slurped up through their proboscis, and they'll carry it back to their nest in a creased stomach. Now, it's the queen that is going to build these little wax pots. So she makes different wax pots. So some of the wax pots will be for storing pollen. So she'll have a little container of pollen. Some will be for storing nectar. And then some will be for storing her eggs. And she'll actually sit on those eggs like a mother chicken to get them warm and help with their development. And new bees will continue emerging throughout that queen's life cycle. And one thing about bumblebees is that they only store a few days worth of food at a time. And that makes them really vulnerable when there are food shortages. The nest becomes really active through the year. So we saw in that little diagram, the numbers can grow from several hundred all the way up to 1,000 members. Now we're at the end of the life cycle of the bumblebee. So towards the end of their cycle, this is Vosnes Enski, and I took this picture kind of the middle of August last summer. So what happens at the end of the life cycle is that the old queen now is going to produce new eggs, but these eggs are different than the worker bees she's produced before. So she's now going to produce male bees, and this is the only time male bees are produced. And then she will produce new females, but these new females will become the new queens. So they go through their 5 weeks of development, and then they emerge and they look for mates. They will mate, and then the new queen, that newly then fertilized queen, will look for a place to overwinter. So now we're at the end of this cycle, and what's going to happen is that old queen who produced all of these little worker bees and the new queens and the new males will die. And all of the worker bees will die. After mating, the male bees will also die. So the only survivor that continues this life cycle will be these newly fertilized queens. Those queens then will go through a state of rest in the soil and be underground for a number of months during the winter months. And then when the temperature is warm, they will then emerge, they'll awaken and emerge and start this whole life cycle again. Now, I'm sure that you've all heard about the decline in bees. To give you an idea, worldwide, 11% of all wild bumblebees are considered to be threatened. And many of the bumblebees that were really common, like the western bumblebee, Bombus occidentalis, used to be the most common bee west of the Mississippi. But now it's rarely seen. When it's seen, you always will see a number of posts on Facebook because people are saying, oh, look at this is where I found it. It's just so rare compared to being the most common. So what's driving this decline? There's a number of things. There's habitat loss due to development. Maybe that used to be your grandma's orchard. There's also invasive species. This is in Squaxin Park in Olympia. You can see how the English ivy has taken over that whole understory. That understory should be really filled with native plants that blossom at different times through the growing season. But they've been outcompeted by the English ivy. And there's also habitat loss due to climate change. And as I do reading, I think this is becoming a really big factor. So we've all are aware of these shifts in temperature and rainfall and snowpack that can push the bees off into suboptimal habitat. Also, there are these mismatches. So in a mismatch, what happens, and these happen more frequently than you might think, is that you get some warm weather and it's warm enough, the bees emerge. But then it's followed by some really cold weather. And it actually happened last year, but about 4 years ago, it really happened where in April, we got a snowstorm and it killed a lot of the blossoms. And to give you an idea, I have a friend who has mason bees, and generally she has about, in the fall when she counts her cocoons, she has over 40,000. But that year, because of the snowstorm, her numbers were only 11,000. So these mismatches can have a really big effect on the bee populations. Also, insecticide use. Think about a blossom. You would never want to put an insecticide on a blossom because a blossom is an invitation to a bee to come and get pollen and nectar. Also, there's a class of insecticides called the neonicotinoids. Neo means new, nicotinoid, it's derived from nicotine. Nicotine has been used as an insecticide since the 1690s. And what makes this insecticide so dangerous is that it is systemically absorbed by the plant. So it's in every aspect of the plant. So it's in the roots, it's in the stem, it's in the blossom, it's in the pollen and nectar. And also note on your seed packets, when you buy seed packets, some of the times you'll read that the seed is coated in neonicotinoids. So just be aware of that. So what is it that we could do to help our pollinators? Surely there's got to be something that we can do. Well, what about building a habitat garden for them? Let's do it. So to do this, you might find that you just have an area that's open and you think, well, shoot, this would be great. I'll do it. I'll build a habitat garden for pollinators right here. Or maybe you have an existing flower garden already and you think to yourself, well, I can just tweak this a little bit more. As I think about it, I think I need more spring plants. I'll just add more spring plants and work on developing this into a habitat garden. You may wonder, well, what's the best option? Should I have this in the sun or should I have it in the shade? Generally, insects and bees love to bask in the sun. So sun is really preferential, but they'll do well in partial shade. And some bees are actually forest bees, some bumblebees. And then from there, you may wonder, well, what should I put in? Should I put in plants or should I put in seeds? Well, to give you an idea, plants come along faster because it's already a developed plant, but they are more expensive. Seeds can take longer to germinate, but they are less expensive. Something really important to consider, though, is the bloom time. So you want to know what time it blooms and then the length of the bloom, because what you are trying to do is have successional blooms in your pollinator garden. If you sow seeds, you can sow seeds in the fall or the spring with success. So fall seeding, another name for fall seeding is nature's way. So you have the flower, it's gone to seed. So there's all these seeds up on the flower head and they start breaking apart and landing on the soil. When they do that, they will, through the winter months, they will get wet. So they get moist and they get cold and that wears on the seed coat. So then by spring, when spring comes along, that seed coat is already worn and that seed then that can just more quickly germinate and develop into a plant. There is a problem though with seed predation. There's some mammals or birds that also like to enjoy those seeds. Spring seeding is really a nice time. The weather's warmer and you can just get out and work your soil. But you have a problem in that a lot of those seeds in these wildflower packets, and I hope that you all got one today, they need those periods of cold and moist to wear on the seed coat. And Ginny Nelson in her talk last week mention what you could do to help with that. You can put a plastic bag, you can put some perlite, you can put your seeds in it with some sawdust or perlite, something like that, and then put a moist paper towel and store it in your refrigerator for several months. And that will simulate the cold, moist weather that they would experience outside. Now remember, when you get seeds or plants started, you need to water them. They need water for germination. They need water for plant establishment. And through the summer, it will increase your nectar also in the plants. And just like Jen Thurman Williams talked about, put your plants in clumps rather than just as an individual plant. So as you plant, develop these areas. They recommend about 3.5 feet by 3.5 feet. Now, when bees go out foraging, and they generally go out for about a 45-minute period, they're not stopping at every flower that they see. Remember how we talked about the lupin, how that bee learned the secret to unlock the lupin and access the pollen and nectar? Once they learn that, they will stay with that type of flower. And so you want to put your flowers in these big clumps, and you want to provide that resource for them. It's very efficient for them to be able to just go through one of those big clumps and collect pollen. And you know that they're just collecting one type of pollen. If you look at their pollen baskets, you'll always see it's either orange or it's golden, but it's all pollen from one source. Also, just like Jen mentioned, include natives. So think about camas. These are early spring plants that I'm mentioning here. Camas is a wonderful flower to get started. And then there's shrubs like Oregon grape. Think of the more flowers that you get when you put in a shrub. And then don't forget trees. Big leaf maples are a major food source for mason bees and bumblebees. So be sure to remember how these native plants have co-evolved with our bees and to include them. Doug Ptolemy has suggested when you put these pollinator gardens together to use about 70% native plants. Also, the bumblebees are active from late winter to late summer. Be sure and include early and late season food resources for them. Remember, as that queen comes up out of the ground, she hasn't had anything to eat for maybe 8-9 months. She needs to feed. So have early food for them before the queen goes down into the soil. Once again, she's got to eat so that she can survive all those months in the soil. So once again, think about successional gardening. Think about having heather, winter heather, and then every textbook mentions the pollen from willow trees, what an incredible benefit it is for our pollinators. And then through the growing season, make sure that you have successional blooms. Now, plant flowers that are attractive to bees. Remember, last week, Mary Anderson talked about nectar guides. So you can see, this is a native plant, actually, it's Douglas iris. So you can see the yellow and pattern of lines that draws the bee into the center of the flower to collect pollen and nectar. You can see a dandelion. We all know what it looks like to us, but you can see the color for a bumblebee or any bee, because bees can see in the UV range. So notice the the range of colors for bees and humans. Bees don't see the color red. Instead, they're really seeing yellows, greens, blues, and violets, as well as ultraviolet. So plant flowers that are colors that they can see. Plant flowers that have long bloom times, like Joe Pyeweed, borage, lupin, and cosmos. And then seed and annuals to keep your garden dynamic with color. So I think if you look out into your garden, if you don't see color, you're not seeing any blooms. So always look for color. Color equals blooms, equals food resources for your bees. In the fall, you can plant early spring bulbs like crocus. And then remember the single petaled flowers like this hollyhock here. It makes so much more accessible for the bee in that they can get into the flower and gather the pollen and get into the nectary of the flower. Native thistles have a very high sugar content, so that makes them a bee favorite. And you can plant high nectar producing flowers like bee balm, honeysuckle, and clover. You can create an herb garden, and that's just a win-win. You can enjoy the herbs, but then also you let them go to flower later in the season, and you will become this big bee magnet that will just surprise you how many bees will gather there. Plant flowers that are aromatic, like lavender. Plant flowers that have really big landing platforms. And then plant tubular flowers that have nectar at the base. Now they've actually found out that there's two different feeding groups for bumblebees, the long-tongued bumblebees and the short-tongued bumblebees. So it's the long-tongued bumblebees that are getting into these tubular flowers and feeding on the nectar. You can plant clover and allow dandelions in your lawn. Remember, manicured lawns are biological deserts to our pollinators. And then you can create your own stem nesting areas, flowers for bees. So to give you an idea, lupin, lily, hollyhocks, dahlias, and delphiniums all have hollow stems. So that creates these stems then for your mason bees. And this is a handout that is online, and we also had them here if anybody wants to get one of these handouts. It goes through the steps of what you need to do to create this stem nesting habitat. And then also we all like to cover our soil in the winter months. So it's recommended to use compost or leaves. You don't want to use like 4 inches of wood chips. Remember how we talked about how those queens need to get into the ground to overwinter? Really hard if you've got 4 inches of wood chips on the top. So leaves are great in that they will retain moisture, they suppress weeds, but they also allow the bees to pass through. There is a handout we put up on our website. So if you're interested in learning how to build native bee nesting boxes, that's up. And it's actually really fun to do this sort of thing. Remember in the summer months to provide water. Pollinators need water during the summer months. Remember, bees don't swim, so put out a lot of landing platforms for them, like rocks. And I've been told that even if you have the most beautiful mason bee nesting block, if you do not have mud available for the bees, a source of mud, they will just pass you by. So make sure that you have an area of exposed soil for them to build their partitions. They say that it takes about 10 trips for a mason bee for every interior partition. So having it close by really helps with their efficiency. Now, bumblebees are generally going to build nests underground, and they generally will use old rodent holes. So leave areas of bare soil. 70% of all native bees nest in the ground. And what we talked about early, this is something that just really blows my mind, I have to say, is that the bumblebees need this exposed soil because when it's time for them to go into this state of rest during their winter months, they will go into the ground. So they go into a little burrow that they've created just 2 inches below the surface of the soil. They're not in any kind of a pupal case or anything. They're just this beautiful bee, this beautiful queen under the soil. And think about what's happening to them. I mean, it's raining and water's going by them. It's been snowing, it's cold, the soil just froze around them. And maybe they're near a soccer field and little kids are running over them. So they're in this deep state of rest, and exposed soil is really necessary for them. You can also put in grasses or even bare grass. Some of the queens will move into, instead of going in the soil, some queens will go into these mats of grass to overwinter. So I just want to remind you that native bees provide an invaluable service to us. So I hope that you will get out and plant a habitat garden for them. So remember a couple things: avoid the use of insecticides, allow exposed soil for nesting and nesting material, and then to have this successive blooms. So late winter, early spring, look out in your garden. Do you see color? Try to get color in your garden, get blossoms going so that these bees, as they're emerging, have a food source. And then walk around again in your garden in the summer months and look at it. Do I have enough food for all of these bees as these colony sizes are growing? And then once again, later in the season, you look around before these queen bumblebees need to go into the soil. You think to yourself, is there food for that queen to eat before she goes into this state of rest in the soil? Because she'll become very depleted. So if you are doing these things, you should feel really happy with yourself, because you are really making a difference. Remember that our bees are in decline. They are keystone species. If they disappear, their disappearance will have a tremendous effect on our ecosystem. Building habitat gardens is really a grassroots effort. And what are we? We're gardeners. And we should really lead this effort in protecting the native bees. Thank you.